Snowflakes were falling, slow and heavy, over the rim of the high mountains when Sonny first heard the muffled cry. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, more like the sound a calf might make when trapped in a drift. But there was no cattle up this high in January, and the voice in that cry wasn't animal. It was human. He stopped where the pine trail cut between two ridges, his breath turning to white mist in the cold air. Snow clung to his beard. His coat was fur-lined and stiff with frost, and the weight of his long rifle was a familiar comfort across his arm. The voice came again, weaker. Sonny was a man who had learned long ago that strange sounds in the wilderness could mean nothing, or could mean a fight you didn't want. The smart thing was to keep riding, get back to his cabin before the sky closed in completely. But something in that sound pulled at him. Not fear, not even pity, more like recognition. He stepped off his horse, the snow crunching deep under his boots, and moved toward the shadow at the base of a spruce. What he found there stopped him cold. The girl couldn't have been more than 16. She was heavy-set, thick in the arms and face, but her weight didn't hide the way she was shivering, or the rope cutting cruel into her wrists. Her hair, dark and tangled, stuck out beneath a torn shawl. Someone had tied a strip of cloth across her mouth, but the snow had wet it through, freezing it stiff. Her eyes shot open at the sight of him, wide and wild. She tried to push herself back against the tree, but the rope held her. Sonny crouched, the snow settling in his hat brim. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and slow, like speaking to a skittish mare. He cut the gag free first, then the ropes. Her hands were raw and bleeding where the fibers had bitten into her skin. She didn't thank him. She didn't speak at all. Just sat there, gulping air, staring like she was trying to decide if he was worse than the men who'd left her here. That was the moment the wind shifted, carrying up the valley the sound of horses. 2, maybe 3. Close. Too close. Sonny glanced toward the sound, then back to her. "You're comin' with me," he said, not asking. He hauled her to her feet, half-dragged her through the snow to his horse. She climbed awkwardly, her weight making the animal shift, but Sonny swung up behind her and turned toward the narrow pass. They were gone into the timber just as the riders crested the far ridge. The mountains fell away into shadowed valleys as they rode, the smell of pine heavy in the cold air. Her breath came in little bursts, half from the cold, half from fear. Sonny didn't speak. Words had their time, and this wasn't it. Hours later, when they reached the split-log cabin tucked against the slope, the sky was black and the snow was easing. He swung her down, guided her inside. The warmth hit them like a wall, the wood stove throwing a red glow across the single room. She stood there in the middle of the cabin, wet and dripping, not looking at him. He set a tin cup of coffee on the table. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated so long he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, "Doesn't matter. Ain't mine no more." Her voice was low, rough-edged. He studied her but didn't push. Names could come later. Shelter came first. That night, as the wind howled against the roof, Sonny lay awake on the cot by the door. Across the room, she slept on a bedroll near the stove, her back to him. He didn't know yet who she was, or why someone had left her to freeze. But the sound of those riders in the pass stayed in his head, like hoofbeats echoing in a canyon. And in the quiet hours before dawn, he knew one thing. Whoever had tied her to that tree wasn't finished with her. He would have to decide soon what kind of man he was going to be when they came looking. The choice was already walking toward him on snowbound hooves. By the third day, word had found its way down from the pass into town. It came in the form of old Amos Rudd, who brought Sonny a fresh whetstone for his traps and, as always, a mouthful of other people's business. "You hear they caught Caleb Varner's girl trying to run?" Amos said, stamping snow from his boots. "Well, not his girl exactly. Some trader from Laramie said he sold her. Punishment for dishonorin' the family name. Don't know the details, but they say she's sizable. Hard to miss." Sonny didn't answer. He was oiling the hinges on his rifle, head bent over the work. "Big girl like that wouldn't last 2 nights in the high timber," Amos went on. Course, they say some mountain man might have picked her up. Foolish if you ask me. Caleb don't take kindly to losin' property. The word property made Sonny's jaw tighten, but he kept his face still. Amos wasn't a bad man. Just one of those who'd lived so long with certain notions he couldn't imagine any different. Amos left by midday, whistling, never knowing he'd been talking about the girl sitting silent by Sonny's stove. Her name, he had learned, was Mary Beth. She spoke little, and when she did, it was clipped, careful, as though words cost more than she could afford. She spent her mornings mending the torn shawl, her afternoons staring out the narrow window at the dark treeline. That evening, Sonny set a pot of beans on the stove. "You got family somewhere else?" he asked, his voice quiet over the bubbling. She shrugged. "Had brothers. They don't talk to me no more." "Why's that?" "'Cause I look like I do. 'Cause I don't move quick enough for Pa." She shifted her gaze to the fire. "He says a girl my size has got one use, and if I can't do that right, I'm just eatin' his bread for nothin'." Sonny felt the old heat rise in his chest, the kind that came from knowing what it was to be written off before you'd been given a chance. "Town says you're Caleb Varner's," he said finally. She gave a bitter half-smile. "Town says a lot, but it's true. He sold me off to a man who lives up by the ridge. Guess I didn't suit him neither. So he tied me up and left me for the wolves." Silence settled, heavy as snow on a pine bough. That night, Sonny thought about the warnings he'd heard in the trading post over the years. About Caleb Varner's temper, his long reach. Men like him didn't just let a thing go. They came for it, and anyone in the way was fair game. By morning, the decision had been gnawing at him so hard he couldn't sit still. He stepped outside into the brittle cold, looked down the slope toward the river. Smoke rose faint from the town. Somewhere down there, the gossip had already grown teeth. Mary Beth came to the door, shawl pulled tight. "You gonna send me back?" He looked at her a long moment. "You want to go back?" Her eyes went sharp. "If I wanted that, I'd have stayed tied to the damn tree." He nodded once. That was all the answer he needed. Around noon, hoofbeats came up the trail, slow, deliberate. A shadow passed the window, and the smell of cold leather and horse sweat filled the air as 3 riders stopped outside. The man in the middle, broad-shouldered, beard thick with frost, didn't bother knocking. He stepped inside like he owned the place. "Evenin', Sonny," he said, smiling without warmth. "We're lookin' for something of ours." Mary Beth didn't move, but her fingers twisted the edge of her shawl. Sonny leaned his rifle against the table, casual but in easy reach. "Ain't seen nothin' of yours," he said. The man's eyes flicked to the girl, then back to Sonny. "Might want to think on that. Caleb Varner's expectin' her back soon." The cabin felt smaller with them inside, the heat of the stove mixing with the cold weight of their presence. "I'll think on it," Sonny said, his tone flat. The man's smile thinned. "Don't think too long. Be a shame if we had to come back after dark." They left without another word, the crunch of hooves fading down the trail. Mary Beth exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for an hour. "They ain't gonna let this go." "No," Sonny said, looking at the door. "They ain't." And he knew, deep in the marrow, that by keeping her here, he'd just stepped across a line he couldn't step back from. 2 nights later, the mountains went still. It wasn't the gentle stillness of snow falling or the quiet of a frozen creek. It was the kind of silence that came when the land itself was listening. No wind in the pines, no owl calls, not even the distant creak of ice shifting on the river. Sonny had felt it before. It meant something was moving out there. He'd been mending a boot by lamplight, Mary Beth dozing by the stove, when it started. A faint thump-thump in the distance, almost too soft to notice. Hoofbeats, steady, measured. Sonny set the boot aside and crossed to the window. The moon was up, silver on the snow, and against that pale glow he caught the movement. 3 riders at the edge of the timber, not moving closer, just watching. Mary Beth stirred. "Is it them?" "Don't matter who it is," Sonny said. "What matters is they're waitin' for something." They didn't come to the cabin that night, or the next, but each morning Sonny found new sign. Hoofprints half filled with snow, A pine branch broken where someone had leaned to look down the slope. An old fire pit still warm. Whoever they were patient. On the third morning, Amos Rudd trudged up the trail again, this time without his easy gossip. His eyes darted to the tree line before he spoke. "Word in town is Caleb's Callan in markers," Amos said quietly. "Men who owe him coin, favors, you know the sort. Ain't no law gonna tell him no. If he's after you, Sonny, you best send that girl back before things get ugly." "Ugly for who?" Sonny asked. "For you. For her. For anyone caught in between." Mary Beth stepped into the doorway, her shawl pulled so tight her knuckles were white. "Tell him I'm not going back." Amos looked at her for the first time since arriving, and something, shame maybe, flickered across his face. "It don't work like that, miss. Out here, a man like Varner." "I said I'm not going back." Her voice was sharp, but her eyes were wet. Amos left without another word, and Sonny watched him vanish down the trail, the cold swallowing his shape. That night, Sonny sat at the table with his rifle laid out in pieces, oiling each part. Mary Beth sat across from him, hands in her lap. "They'll come before long," he said. "Maybe tomorrow, maybe a week. When they do, they won't be here to talk." Mary Beth didn't flinch. "I'm not scared of them anymore." "You should be," Sonny said. "Fear's what keeps you alive." The next afternoon, he was splitting wood when the sound came. A low, steady drumbeat, faint but clear, carried on the wind. Not war drums exactly, but the rhythm was meant to carry a message. Mary Beth stepped outside. "What is it?" "Warning," Sonny said, eyes scanning the ridges. And then he saw it. A thin column of smoke rising on the far slope. Then another, and another. Signal fires. By sundown, more riders had gathered at the tree line, their shapes black against the snow. Not 3 this time, a dozen, maybe more. Some carried rifles across their saddles. Others just sat still, watching. Inside, the cabin felt like a box closing in. The girl's breathing was fast, her eyes darting toward the door. Sonny stood near the window, his shadow long in the lamplight, the decision already heavy in his chest. He could send her out now, end it before it turned bloody, or he could see it through and risk the fight. Either way, there'd be no peace until the choice was made. And somewhere deep in the quiet, he knew they weren't going to wait for morning. The riders didn't come at dawn. They came in the dead center of the night, when the fire in the stove had burned low and the world outside was black as pitch. Sonny had been half asleep in the chair, rifle across his lap, when a crunch in the snow snapped him awake. Not the light step of a fox or the scurry of a rabbit. This was heavier, deliberate. Boots. More than one pair. He rose without a sound, easing toward the window. Moonlight spilled across the clearing, pale as old bone, and in it he saw them. 3 men moving toward the cabin from the front, 2 circling wide toward the back. Rifles slung, coats pulled tight. Mary Beth was already awake, sitting up on the bedroll, eyes wide. She didn't ask what was happening. She didn't need to. Sonny crossed to the stove, slid a piece of iron pipe into her hands. "If one of 'em gets inside, you swing till they ain't movin'." She nodded once, jaw tight. The first knock wasn't really a knock. It was a flat-palmed slam against the door. "Sonny!" A voice called, deep and cold. "Ain't no need to make this worse. Send her out and we ride away." Sonny stayed silent. The men outside shifted, their boots grinding the snow. "You got till I count 3, the voice said. 1. Mary Beth gripped the pipe tighter. 2. Sonny stepped to the door, but didn't open it. His voice was calm, even. "You come through this door, you best not miss." There was no 3, just the sudden splinter of wood as the door frame shuddered under a boot. Sonny fired once through the gap, the blast echoing off the trees. A man cursed and stumbled back. The fight didn't rush, it crawled. Men shouting, boots pounding through snow, the sharp crack of rifles. But inside, there was a strange quiet between each noise. Mary Beth crouched low, her breath fast and sharp, the pipe ready. One of the back men made it to the window, his face a shadow against the frost. Before he could climb through, Mary Beth swung hard. The sound of iron against bone was sickening. He went down without a sound, vanishing into the snow. When the shooting stopped, the clearing was empty. Just the pale drift of breath from Sonny's mouth, the smell of black powder, and a long trail of hoofprints leading away into the timber. Mary Beth sat back against the wall, the pipe still in her lap, her hands trembling now that it was over. Sonny reloaded slow, watching the tree line. "They'll be back," he said. Mary Beth looked up at him, her eyes burning in the dim light. "Then we don't run." Something in her tone, steady, unflinching, made him pause. The girl who had barely spoken when he found her was gone. In her place was someone who'd stood her ground. The night outside stayed quiet after that, but it was the kind of quiet that came before a storm. And Sonny knew, just as sure as he knew his own name, that the next time Caleb Varner's men came up this mountain, they wouldn't be coming to scare him. They'd be coming to finish it. By morning, the snow had stopped, leaving the world outside the cabin wrapped in a cold, deceptive peace. Sunlight glinted off the drifts like powdered glass. The clearing was still, save for the faint marks where men had bled into the snow and the churned path of retreating hooves. Sonny stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, scanning the timberline. Nothing moved. The smoke from the stove drifted straight into the pale sky. But his gut told him the silence was only a pause. Inside, Mary Beth was tending the small iron pot on the stove, her movements slow but certain. The pipe she had used the night before leaned against the wall. It wasn't fear in her eyes now, it was something heavier, steadier. "They'll come with more," she said, not turning from the stove. Sonny nodded. "Ain't just about you anymore. It's about me standin' in their way." Mary Beth looked over her shoulder. "Then maybe it's time you let me speak for myself." He studied her, the weight of her words hanging in the still air. She wasn't asking to be hidden anymore. She wasn't asking for him to fight her battles. Later that day, just as the shadows were stretching long, movement appeared at the far edge of the clearing. Not riders this time, on foot. 6 men walking slow, rifles down but visible. In the middle was Caleb Varner himself, broad, heavy in the shoulders, his thick coat brushing against the snow as he came. Sonny stepped out onto the porch, his rifle resting across his forearm. Mary Beth followed, pulling her shawl tighter, but not hiding behind him. Caleb stopped just short of speaking distance, eyes on Mary Beth. "Girl," he called, voice carrying like a cold wind. "You've had your fun. Time to come back." Mary Beth's voice was steady when she answered. "I'm not yours." A chuckle ran through the men behind Caleb, but he didn't smile. "You're what I say you are. And right now I say you're coming with me. Or he jerked his chin towards Sonny, "won't be walking back into town again." Sonny's hand tightened on the rifle. But before he could speak, Mary Beth stepped forward. "You sold me like I was worth less than a mule," she said. "Then you let a man leave me to freeze. If that's the kind of family you're off, Aaron, I'd rather take my chances out here." Caleb's face darkened. "You think the law cares what you'd rather? Out here, my word is the law." She took another step forward, her boots sinking into the snow. "Then maybe it's time somebody said no to your law." For a long moment, the clearing held its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. Finally, Caleb spat into the snow. "This ain't done." He turned, signaling his men. They followed, their boots crunching in unison until the forest swallowed them. Mary Beth stood there, watching the place they'd vanished. Her breath fogged in the cold, but her hands didn't shake. Sonny came to stand beside her. "You just made yourself a bigger target," he said. She looked at him, calm and certain. "Maybe, but at least I ain't hiding anymore." The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches. Somewhere deep in the timber, the faint echo of an axe striking would carried through the stillness. And for the first time since Sonny had cut her free from that tree, there was something in her gaze he hadn't seen before. It wasn't fear. It was the start of a fight worth having.